Okay. Today we're here to look at Section C of the Year 12 English exam. So looking at analysing and presenting argument. What are the steps to success in this section of the exam? What are some of the skills that I need to tackle it? And what should be my exam technique? I strongly suggest that you read the article during reading time. Once for understanding, but then again for the main points and for the language strategies. You should begin your exam by writing Section C. You will not have time to go back and reread the article again during writing time. This would be a poor strategy for time management. Once you are able to pick up a pen and a highlighter in writing time, it's important to make a couple of notes before you begin writing Section C. Highlight or label the main contention. What are the supporting arguments and where do they appear? Trying to find 3 or more, you need to be really flexible and it really depends on the depth and number of arguments presented. But then you also need to look for some important language within those arguments. Where are a number of language strategies that are worthy of consideration and discussion? Once you have those couple of things organised, then you can start writing it up. Today we're going to be using this sample as a bit of a guide as to how to tackle the exam. Today we're looking at the editorial, The Cynical Selling of Anzac Tradition, which was published in the pages of the daily newspaper. Then we also have, in response, Helen Scheller writing a letter to the editor in response with the title, Anzac Day, Don't Let Hype Drown the Essential Message. This was later published with an accompanied illustration, so a separate illustration to the returning letter and separate to the original editorial. And this is by cartoonist Bruce Perry. You can see there the separate letter, and again, there is an accompanying image. So what do I need to wrap my head around first? You must be able to identify the contention and the arguments used by the writers. Questions that you should be asking yourself. What is the writer's contention and what are the main arguments? The main contention presents the writer's overall point of view on the issue. It's often presented in a single sentence early in the piece, perhaps in the title, but it's not uncommon for writers to also get to their contention towards the end. For example, you should be able to put it in a statement like, same-sex marriage should be legalised in Australia. Some sentence starters that you may use in your introduction to introduce the contention include, the writer asserts that, the writer contends that, the writer claims, or in a something tone, the writer declares. You need to be thinking about how these words work together to get across the overall purpose of the contention. If they're not declarative, don't use that word. There needs to be some type of connect between the words you choose to describe the contention and what it truly is. This is the same for supporting arguments. A writer has their main contention, but this needs to be supported and built up by arguments. Arguments are multiple reasonable points that appear throughout the piece that connect and are essentially the reason and the justification for the main contention. For example, if the contention was same-sex marriage should be legalised, well, what are the reasons? For example, same-sex couples express love in the same way heterosexual couples do. That is a justification of the contention. Again, you will need to be able to highlight the arguments. In each of your paragraphs, the argument should be the hero. After all, this is argument analysis. You might wish to start each of your paragraphs by outlining what the argument is. You could start with something really simple like the writer argues that, or start to really craft those topic sentences with the position of the writer is further emphasized by asserting, or in a something tone, the position of the writer is further elaborated to, and keep going from there. You'll also need to gather yourself some of the text details. You cannot present a very general analysis of the topic. You must be very specific in this area of study. Identify the text type. Is it a letter to the editor? Is it an opinion piece, an editorial, a cartoon, a speech, or a blog? Each of these text types will link to a different purpose, have a different form, and a different way of persuading. So you must consider the text type as part of your analysis. You will also be able to look at the tone, and the tone will shift throughout the article. Just because one argument is presented in one tone doesn't mean that the writer continues that tone in each of their arguments. You should revise your tone words. Does the writer sound outraged, excited, jubilant, concerned? You must have a variety of language for this section. What about the intended audience? Apart from identifying the argument, this is the next most important part of this area of study. You must look for specific stakeholders who are interested and are the purpose of this piece. Why have this group been targeted? Why are this group being convinced? You must consider, who are they aiming the piece at? You will actually need to ask yourself, who wants to read this? Who cares about this? Because how can you analyze if you do not know who the audience is? You cannot say the reader, and you cannot say the general Australian public. There is a specific readership in mind, potentially more than one, and you must come up with names for these different stakeholders. Are they parents? Are they teachers? Are they residents of X neighbourhood? You must be very specific. General analysis will not score well on the exam. Lastly, look at the intended purpose. All of these things working together have a purpose. Again, ask yourself, why is this piece being written? And what will the impact be on specific stakeholders? What will the impact be on the parents reading this? What will the impact be on the residents of X neighbourhood? And why? Whenever you get stuck, and if your teacher is giving you feedback that you are not detailed enough in your analysis, keep coming back to these key questions. Why is it being written? Who is being impacted? Why is that person being impacted? You will also need some language strategies. We're deliberately not using the words here, persuasive techniques, because we want you to move away from labeling techniques and thinking that that is analysis. There are materials out there on the internet linked to the old study design called language analysis, which is a completely different task. So please be careful when you are looking at past exams. So post 2016, pre-2016, but also if there are materials online, please obviously think carefully. So you will need to consider the language, but it's all about how this language builds the argument. What language strategies are being used? Perhaps highlight a couple of important sections of the text, but only sections that are relevant to the arguments that you are going to discuss. What little bits of language within that section are relevant to how the argument is being built? And then you need to consider what is the effect of this language. So these strategies are used by the author in their writing in order to convince the audience to side with their main contention. It's important that you can identify different techniques, but most importantly, that once you've identified the technique, you can describe the effect they have on a, again, specific audience. I've got some sentence starters here and they're color coded. Red, not good. Orange, okay. Green, much better. If you're writing things like, the writer uses a rhetorical question which positions the reader to, or the writer establishes the use of a appeal to justice that further blah, blah, blah. That word uses is signposting that you are labeling. Please try to avoid these types of phrases as much as possible. What you want to have is more of an allusion to the different types of language being used, have different ways of saying the language strategies so you are varying your language yourself, because what you don't want is this formulaic, template-looking essay that some of the weaker students need to get started. Something you could say, through the repetition of the word the effect is. Or with a series of rhetorical questions, the writer aims to. It's a little bit better, but what I do see is that that technique is really kind of plonked in there still, but it's better than the labeling ones in red that just say, use this. Even better in green. Citing extensive data builds up the credibility of, or highly emotive language such as something forces us to accept. So just trying to change up your sentence structure and your language to allude to the different types of language strategies. Once you've done that, you will need to be able to explain the intended effect. Now, each language strategy has different intended effect words. You will need to study and revise this so your analysis is making sense. If you say that, yes, the writer has implemented a rhetorical question, rah, 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 well, what's the impact of that? You might say it makes something memorable, or it's designed to highlight something. That would be accurate. If you have, say, let's look at another one there, inclusive language. You could say, obviously, inclusive language is designed to include what particular readership. But most importantly, you could change that language to say, establishes a sense of commonality. So feel free to use this table, in particular, the far right column, where there are lots of effect words that match up with particular strategies. If you're using the wrong effect with the wrong strategy, you come off as not knowing the purpose and the impact of language. There's more of this in your textbook as well. So once I've kind of got my head around all of the bits and bobs of my article that I've been given, how do I write it up? What are the key features of each section of my response? So you will need to include an introduction. And in your introduction, you should start with the trigger. What is the issue? How did it come about? Refer to the background information and essentially have 1 to 2 neutral sentences or an overview of the topic. Then you need to introduce each text. If there are 2 pieces, please introduce them both briefly in the introduction. If there's only one, again, that's fine, but keep in mind the purpose of an introduction is to introduce the entirety of your response, so you must include each text. Some of the things that you may include about your text, obviously the author's name, their text type, perhaps the source, if it is relevant, where it's come from. Again, you can get this from your background information. What's their main contention, their tone, target audience, and then identify if the text share the same viewpoint or have a different viewpoint. You shouldn't really be getting down to the analysis in the introduction. It is more a brief overview, but that's a lot to include, all of those points. Try to wrap them up in neat sentences and have those sentences address a couple of those tick points in one go. There's no reason that you need to write an individual sentence on each point. If you are struggling, you could use something like this to assist you in your construction of your beginning introductions. But what we would like to see from you is by the time the exam rolls around, you're moving away from this kind of formulaic methodology and you do become a little bit more organic in your construction. Something like this would be an appropriate length of introduction and contains most of the required elements. Let's have a quick read. Cognizant of the increasing trend of businesses to commercialise commemorative occasions as a strategy for increasing their profits, many have voiced concern that the dignity and gravity of dates such as Anzac Day are being eroded. So there, I start with what the general issue is. Now I'm going to introduce the articles. As a leading voice in Australian media, The Age utilises its editorial to condemn businesses for their exploitation of a day they regarded as sacred. Whilst Helen Scheller, in her responsive letter to the editor, acknowledges the lamentable appropriation of such occasions for official profit. She offers a more pragmatic response to the situation, pragmatically accepting that such economic activity is now an inevitable reality. Rather than worrying about this, she asserts that the futility of war is the more important message for society to focus on. So we haven't revealed any language strategies. Here we are just highlighting these key points. Now, how many body paragraphs do you need to write? What should I include in each of my body paragraphs? How long should they be? Now, some of these questions, my only answer to you is it depends. You must be flexible and you must make decisions on the day of the exam that best suit the article or articles you have been provided. There is no set formula for the number and length of the paragraphs. You might go in with a general strategy of, I'm going to need at least 3 paragraphs. Perhaps if one text is particularly long, I'll write 2 paragraphs on that, and 1 if there's only a really short piece. But what if you have a really, really long first piece and a little comment? You might say, there are many small points within this first article. I'm going to write 4 short body paragraphs and 1 on the comment. Or maybe you have 2 of equal length and you're writing 3 on the first one, 2 on the second one. It is really up to you as the student to make the call based on the number of arguments in each text and the length and depth of each text. So please just be flexible and make the best decisions you can at the time. You must also remember when you're doing that you must work in the discussion of the visual somewhere appropriate. Don't leave it to the end. You do need to think where the visual actually works best and with which arguments. Here's an example of following the PEEP structure. PEEP kind of stands for persuasive technique, evidence, effect, and then perceived impact on the audience. Now, remember, you do want to move away from labelling. I won't read through the whole thing here, but I will highlight some of the features. What the body paragraph starts with is the argument. The editor of The Age fervently proclaims his disgust towards the commercialisation of Anzac Day, claiming it instead should be done with reverence, not against the backdrop of brands touting beer. We're not discussing the language yet. You are just highlighting what is the argument that this person has put in their article. Then you can choose a couple of language strategies to discuss. And again, discuss how they build the argument. The adjective of touting establishes the idea that those pretending to promote festivities are instead seeking to ensure profitability. The adjective itself carries a connotation of the salespeople being persistent, further exacerbating the depiction of the business solely working for profits, while simultaneously presenting to the public, soldiers and patriots, the clear lack of respect towards a sombre Australian holiday. I can see that they're talking about descriptive language, such as touting. I can see they're talking about negative connotations of that word. But most importantly, the analysis tells me who it's focused at, soldiers and patriots. And the intent is to highlight the clear lack of respect towards the Australian holiday. There is a bit more there, so I will let you read that in your own time. But what we need to keep in mind is the structure. The argument is the hero. The language strategies support how that is being constructed, and that you must analyse through the lens of the stakeholders. How are soldiers and patriotic Australians reacting to reading this? Let's look at this zoomed in. When you're discussing the language strategies, you should allude to the persuasive device. And by that, I mean, do not label, work it into your sentence structure. You should then have short, sharp extracts as evidence. You must have quotes from the article, from the exact section, looking at the exact language strategy. After you've done that, you need to explain yourself and explain the effect of these particular words on the particular audience and the argument. So there's two things there that you need to get to. How does it impact the audience and how does it build or impact the argument? For example, by referencing the commercialisation of Anzac Day as invariable and reminding patriotic Australians to expect any different is an illusion, Scheller simultaneously condones the attempt to make money by companies, but also recognises that to expect other would be naive, unlike The Age, whose only purpose is to name and shame. In doing so, Scheller compels The Age to recognise the narrow-mindedness of their editorial and exposes the media outlet as out of touch with current marketing and festive practices in Australia. So keep in mind that Scheller here has two audiences. She is writing back to the editor of The Age. They are part of her intended audience, but also patriotic Australians. Most of the focus here is the impact. It talks about keywords, condoning, recognising, compels the age to recognise, points out the narrow-mindedness of, presents them as out of touch. This is the type of stuff that we do want to see. You'll also notice that it is very specific. It's not saying the issue. It's saying the commercialisation of Anzac Day. It's not saying the reader. It's saying patriotic Australians. It's not saying the contention. It's saying current marketing and festive practices in Australia are out of touch. You need to make sure that you are writing in a really specific manner and that none of these phrases end up in your essay. One thing that many students have forgotten, and it is an important part of this assessment, is to analyse the visual. Now, I'm saying visual because you could end up with anything. It could be a photograph, it could be a cartoon, it could be a graph, and you'll need to call it out and label it what it is. Please don't just say the visual. It will be a specific type of visual, and you will need to emphasize that just like you would emphasize a text type. It is not enough for you just to simply state there is a visual. You must analyze it. If you do these three things, you are heading towards analysis. You should tell me what the overall contention of the image is. Why is it here and what message is it presenting? Then tell me how the image has been constructed. What is it of? What are the most important features of it? And then what are the considerations, the connotations and overall message of this image, and how does it work to support one of the arguments? Again, I'll read just the introduction here where it says, Bruce Perry further emphasises the futility of war and the sombre reason behind our National Day. So there is the argument. That is what this image represents. But what about the construction? Perry's cartoon depicting a coin with the phrases sacrifice, honour and bravery on one side and tragic human waste on the other shows a cartoon that references the historically significant game of two-up, which presents both sides of armed conflict, being that armed conflict should be avoided at all costs, just as Scheller argues. So we can see here that the student who's written this is really considering what is the message or what is the argument? How does the image and the specific features of the image work together to then come up with an overall message? One thing that I want to highlight before we start looking at how to extend yourself is how this exam actually varies from the SAC that you will have done at school. Now, the SAC that you did at school required you to compare 2 articles or 3 articles if you were given them together. The exam does not want you to do that. You still may be given 2 or more pieces, but it is not part of the criteria that you compare them. Instead, VCAR assessors say that you should write how they complement each other. So just to read you a little bit of summary on this point, VCAR assessors do not want you to compare the text in the exam. The idea is just to say or mention how the texts connect to each other. In what way are these 2 pieces related? Perhaps it is a divergent response, or perhaps they are writing in response specifically. Just like these pieces here, Scheller's letter is in response, talking back to the editor of the Age. That's how they're connected. I don't need to sit there and say how Scheller's arguments and Scheller's language diverge or overlap with the editorial. If it was the SAC, yes, I would have to do that, but not for the exam. What you should keep in mind is where and when was the second text published? Who was it by? What was their purpose? How do these pieces connect? And here are some sentence starters to help you. Is it writing in response? Is it presenting an alternative viewpoint? Is it complementing X's argument? Is it constructing in a slightly different manner or offering another opinion? That's all you need to do. You do not need to compare and contrast the arguments and language used. And that's it. That's how you really tackle this section of the exam. If you are looking to extend yourself, keep watching the video because I have some handy tips. So, handy tip 1. As already gone through in more detail, please make sure that you analyse the visual in one of your paragraphs. Don't leave it as standalone and don't leave it till the end. Use this formula to help you embed this in one of your paragraphs. Describe the image, analyse the language if there is any language, or analyse the features, and explain the main message. Again, if you are writing in a basic formulaic way, such as the writer uses an appeal to fear, you will not be able to score highly in this area of study. If you have any past practice essays, go back through them and focus on writing sentences better. Move away from basic, cross through them, and make them a better constructed sentence, such as, the writer appeals to the fears of the parents, and explain what the actual fears of the parents are. Get into it. Instead of saying the writer uses an attack and then plonking in a quote, say the writer attacks who, why, quote. Make sure that you have the detail and the sentence structure to really improve the fluency and the depth of your analysis. Make sure that you spend some time in preparation for the exam actually studying the effect words and the meta language for this area of study. You cannot make it up. This is something just like legal studies or psychology, where there are actual terms that you need to know and use in appropriate places. And if you interchange them and mix them up, it is actually incorrect. So make sure you know the matching effect words and the specific language for the issues that you have been given. Use your past exams to have a look at any general language your teacher may have circled, look at the booklets of language that we've provided, and most importantly, look at your textbook. It is all written in there for you to learn and study. You must make the arguments the hero if you are trying to get the 10 out of 10 for this area of study. At the forefront of each paragraph should be the writer's argument, but that is not enough just to write that sentence. Your analysis of the argument is so important. When you discuss the language choices of the writer, it should be done through the lens of how does this build the argument? How does this persuade the audience to believe the writer's overall contention? So make sure that when you are writing, you have an introduction to the argument in your opening sentence. Then you might talk about the language, but then you have to come back to the argument. Then you might talk about some more language, but then you must come back to the argument. Please make sure that you are doing that. If you are just talking about the audience, then you are not actually making the arguments the hero. Also, make sure that you are structuring creatively. Again, this is the hardest thing for some of our high achieving students to tackle, is the fact that you must be flexible. Huge paragraphs of detailed analysis versus short paragraphs that map the arguments. What should I do? You will not be able to ask your teacher this on the day. You must practice a variety of articles in order to start being flexible under timed conditions. You make the judgment decisions when being faced with new materials. Map out the writer's arguments, focus on what are the most influential points. You're not going to be able to analyze everything, but you have to make the judgment call on what is most influential. And unfortunately, again, it just comes down to practice. Have you exposed yourself to a range of different trial exams? If you haven't, You need to start doing that immediately. Finally, you must advance your vocabulary. Once you have learned all of the language strategies and their effect words, you also need words to describe things like persuasive intent and tone. Please go out and create yourself a glossary. You cannot sound repetitive. You cannot use the word bolsters 15 times to describe how the argument is being constructed. You will have your go-to words, but the people who spend time extending their vocabulary to be much wider and then choose words that are actually appropriate to what the argument is saying and how it's being constructed. Those students who have top word choice and a wide vocabulary to get that top choice obviously do much better in this area of study. All right, and that is it for section C of the exam.